Hello and welcome, I'm Kira Scribner, and today I'm going to be talking for the love of classics, which is great because it's my favorite genre. I really appreciate it. Obviously, genre is a little bit misleading because there isn't just one genre. We have fantasy classics, we have poetry, we have books that were historical fiction that are now classics, so I just group them all together. I think for me, why I call it a genre is because of the fact that, to me, I go for it because I love the history. I love the integration of history and English and how people look at different times and different seasons and just really seeing through their point of view. I was jumping ahead of myself, so I'm going to actually ask the questions rather than monologue on classics. The first one is, why do you read classics? How often and kind of from where? For me, I think I read about 3 to 4 depending on the month, and sometimes I'll read like 8 classics and other months I'll read like 1 or none. I really love writing, and I really love writing now too. But I find classic books really funny. One of the funny self-deprecating jokes that I tell a lot is about the fact that people often don't think that I'm funny when I think that I'm hilarious, and people will just be like, well, you're not funny. You never tell jokes. And I'm like, no, I tell jokes all the time. And they just look at me and they look strange. And my friend turned to me once and was like, yes, because your humor is like C.S. Lewis, which I think was the only classic author he could think of. The writing style, the humor, the satire, to me, that is just gold. Like, I laugh so much in classics. Like, even when it's trying to be serious, like Jane Eyre. Does my forehead offend you? I love making fun of the ridiculousness of books. I love the history of it, and I just have a lot of fun reading classics. Okay, the next question is, what period versus country and such do you want to read more classics of? And for this, I have to answer what classics I also read the most of. I would say that I read mostly 20th century classics. I know that Victorian classics are probably the most famous, but they're not the ones that I tend to go into. I love the 1910s and I love the 1890s. World War I is my favorite historical event, and I'm very much drawn to the birth of modernity and the Age of Innocence. Like that stuff is my jam because I love how we went through this war and then like nothing ever looked the same, and how things utterly changed. That era of like when we're on the cusp of like modernity, we're on the cusp of like cars and electricity and all of these things, and it's all changing. Like, I find it so interesting. I would love to read more Victorian novels. I would love to read more 17th and 18th century stuff. I really enjoy the humor and the style of it. Like Lover's Vows is a book that I absolutely loved. I love The Castle of Otranto. I'm currently reading Moll Flanders, which is very interesting. There's a very different kind of style because the novel was kind of invented in this era, and it's interesting how things are adjusted to that. I really want to read more Asian literature and Asian classics as well. I've really loved translated poetry. I've read some Vietnamese and Iranian. It's been really wonderful and I love it. So I want to read more. I also really want to read some South American. With Allende, I really love the work that I've read for it, and I really want to read more magical realism. I've also read some Machado de Assis, which I'm probably butchering. His work is really funny and super interesting and very eclectic with all of his different sources, and that's, Brazilian literature. I really wish diverse classics were easier to get on a limited budget. My dream would be to read a lot of classics from every single country because I want to read that in general. I love learning about history, and I want to like jam pack my mind full of like historical knowledge and classics, so I would like to do it all over the place. The next question is, what book do you think will be a classic in 100 years? So there's a lot of books that I could be like classic, like The Vanishing Half or like Harry Potter or surprise, all of these books that I think that will probably be classics in 100 years. However, this is a book that has received a fair amount of praise but is definitely not that well known, and I think that it hits like the literariness of classics because you want books that tell a lot about the time period, you want books that are very well written, sometimes inventive, sometimes less popular in its era, and I think that this is perfect. And this is Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. The writing is immaculate. I have some quotes to read to you and I will. But first of all, like, I had trouble getting into this. Like, it was a little bit like too much and I was like, what's going on? But then once it got into it, it was amazing. And what we know about literary people is that sometimes we're a little bit pretentious. We like books that are like, okay, this was hard, but also super rewarding. And I think that it will say a lot about things, and it's gorgeously written. It's nice and short, which modern classics tend to be that, and I think will be lovely. So, as an example of some of the writing we have, their once great romance spun into a period piece. They gently slipped into poverty. The widest gulf in the world is the distance between getting by and not quite getting by. Putting her on a pedestal is another way of being alone. He never stopped being your father, but he was no longer your dad. These are quotes that are simple, evocative, and cut to the center of being, and they're also things that are universal. And I think that the story and the place of Asian identity is something that, is only starting to be talked about now. We have definitely done not a great job of representing Asian stories in literature, and I think that that is something we will look back on in the future, and I think that this is a very interesting, inventive way with lots of cool storytelling and themes. Is the last classic you finished, and this is A Streetcar Named Desire. I've been meaning to read Tennessee Williams for quite a while, and I loved it. The Glass Menagerie is probably my next, but if you like Tennessee Williams or other mid-century plays, because I went down like this rabbit hole of like all of these mid-century things and I'm super enjoying it. So I want to read more plays. That's also a hope of mine. And I want to read more of his plays. So please recommend some plays to me. This is a story that is not completely flawless when it comes to representing females, but it definitely has the toxicness of it, and it's just written and constructed so beautifully with so well themed. Like, I did listen to it on a full cast, so I think that can add to him conveying it through only the words, but it's a play, so it wasn't meant to only be read. Question number 5 is the first classic you ever read. The first classic that I remember that was read to me was the Chronicles of Narnia. I loved these as a child. I was like the first stan. I created my own Wikipedia things. I loved it. I was obsessed with Narnia as a child. And then Anne of Green Gables, I believe, is the first classic that I ever read myself. I have talked extensively about my love of Anne, having a girl who is represented as this person who is an outsider and then through imagination and intelligence overcomes and learns to find family in unexpected places is so beautiful. As a child, that was incredibly, incredibly lonely and just wanted friends and used too big words and pretentiousness to try to feel valid. Her story of acceptance and finding herself and of a community is so beautiful. Actually, my roommate just read the book and was like, oh my goodness, this is so strange. Like, there are so many mannerisms and weird things and like, you know, things that you say or do that remind me of Anne, and I understand you so much more now. I was like, oh, Anne is a little bit of my life, and she will be mentioned quite a few times through here because she is one of my favorite novels, and I don't know why I'm referring to her as a she. I know that I love classic covers, however, I'm just staring and like looking around me like I can't decide. So I will look at some ones and I will put them on the thing and we'll talk about the beauty of classic covers. However, there's also so many of them. Number 7 is a classic author who you wish had written more. And Jane Austen is kind of the classic thing. Like, Jane Austen is incredible and lovely, and I would have loved to see her read more. Another one is also Sylvia Plath. I've only read one of her books, but I really, really enjoyed it. For both of them, I would love them to have lived longer, especially Sylvia Plath, who, you know, died by suicide. I really wish that she had found hope and she had found a reason to continue going on, because she was only 29 when she died, and I think that she had a lot to live in the world. It's also incredible to remember that Sylvia Plath could have been alive today, that she's that young. I think my true answer from an author that I've read quite a bit of that I would have loved to see write more is Shirley Jackson. She only wrote 2 novels, and that was The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in a Castle, and she wrote a number of short stories, which I read a lot of, and I really, really enjoy her short stories, and I would have loved. She was only 49 when she died, and I would have loved her to write and to live longer and to tell stories. Number 8 is my least favorite classic. There's a lot, and An Island of Dr. Moreau is a recent one that I haven't completely ranted about, and I was so excited for this because I was told that it has like the questions of what is creation and what can science do, and kind of, it was published in the 1890s, so it was kind of the perfect era to talk about, you know, we're talking about evolution, we're talking about, you know, Jesus and how does these things go together. As someone who loves science and loves religion, I thought it would be super interesting to talk about. I also liked but not fully loved 2 of H.G. Wells' books before, so I was like, this could be finally the time. This is the book that will be like my perfect book for him. It was not enjoyable, it was quite boring, and it was also just so painfully racist. Because we're looking at the story in which this man is using animals in order to spice and hopefully make humans better. He's gene splicing animals and human DNA and all of these things. However, it's kind of a mystery. We don't know what's going on. This man is just shipwrecked and he's seeing all of these things and he's like, why does this man seem a little bit off? However, the way that he tries to show that the people are a little bit off, and he got run out of England, that's why he's on this island in the middle of nowhere, because he was disbarred from polite society and science stuff. However, he's doing this by showing that, like, you know, one of them is acting in the stereotypically racist way, and you having a hot take about people that aren't completely like English society being less than human, and using that in a metaphor for like how the world is getting, I don't know. I really enjoy conversations about playing God. Like, Frankenstein is one of my favorite classics, so I enjoy this kind of topic. It's just the way that it was written was incredibly racist and incredibly boring, and also not that exciting. Like, maybe I would have found it very exciting and revolutionary at the time. I just didn't. What is my favorite translated classic has to go to Spring Essence by Ho Jun Han. I really, really liked it. She was a poet and a concubine in Vietnam in 1801. She lived from like the 1770s. She lived from 1772 to 1820s, and she wrote poetry, and she was a concubine. I really, really like her poetry. I was like, okay, I'm gonna read this and it's gonna be interesting historically, and I was like, no, this is like really, really resonant. She talks really openly and beautiful, gorgeous poetry. And it's interesting because she's also very open about talking about sexuality and, you know, quite feminist for an 1801. So it's like how we look at women in 1801 and how we look at Ho Jan Huan is just amazing. So I want to read some of her poetry, and I think that her being a concubine and her being a woman who was made to be a lesser wife definitely comes into this as well. Gray sky, a rooster crows, bitter I look onto the thicket of folds. I haven't shaken grief's rattle, yet it clatters. I haven't run sorrow's bell, though it tolls. Their noise only drags me down, angry, angry with a fate that says I'm much too bold. Men of talent, learned men, where are you? Am I supposed to walk as if I'm stooped and old? Like, dang. Like, man, she's like, yeah, am I supposed to walk like I'm stooped and old? Like, no, I'm not. I'm going to stand up. And this one is specifically about being a concubine. Screw the fate that makes you share a man. One cuddles under cotton blankets, the other's cold. Every now and then, well, maybe or maybe not, once or twice a month. Oh, it's like nothing. You try to stick it like a fly on rice, but the rice is rotten. You slave like a maid, but without pay. If I had known how it would go, I think I would have lived alone. Like, she's like, yeah, no, I have no time to share my husband. She's like, I have my own desires to do life and to, you know, be respected and loved, and I will not be quiet even if you think that I'm too bold. So if you want like beautiful, feminist and evocative and like poignant stories and poetry by a woman who lived in 1801 Vietnam, yeah, no, great. As an added aside, I also think Anna Karenina is a great translated work of fiction. Question number 10 is my favorite modern classic. I love modern classics. It tends to be what I read most of. And one that I think that is completely contemporary and beautiful and gorgeous is a nonfiction work by Martin Luther King Jr., Letter from Birmingham Jail. And I want to read one quote from it because it's amazing. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the cholic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. And the rest of this is just quotes. I love it so much, and he says it so powerfully and beautifully, and I think it's a modern classic that really speaks to the civil rights era, but also really speaks to now, and I love it. Another modern classic that I love that was recently republished and, you know, collected is the short stories of Zora Neale Hurston. They're collected in Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick, and so good. I really, really love her humor. I love her humanity. There's something about like the 1920s, 30s, 40s that I just really, really love, and she hits it and nails it. I had read 2 of her plays beforehand and loved them, and they're just incredibly evocative and wonderful, and I absolutely adore them. I have not read her novel, Their Eyes Are Watching God, but I really recommend reading her. She's definitely too obscure for her talent. Number 11 is a classic place I would like to visit. And England, is that too broad? Like, I want to go to England so badly. I want to go to the UK. I want to like see the castles, but I also want to like go to the cool like historical things. Because I've been reading a lot of Jane Austen, like Bath comes into my mind. Like I would love to go to Bath. I would love to go into the pump room, like, because it's still there. I searched it up. I would just love to go to all of the birthplaces and like, you know, Stratford-on-Avon and like, you know, the theaters. So number 12 is kind of a difficult question because it's the first classic you would recommend to a child, and it really depends on the child. But I also have a story for this. When I was 16, I was babysitting these children, and I did babysitting them for probably like 7 or 8 hours. They were getting very angry that their parents weren't there. They were at the time 6, 4, 2, and I think I had the baby. I can't remember if I had the baby or not, but it had been quite a while. It had been like all of Saturday, and they were whiny and tired, and they needed to go to bed, and they just wanted to see their parents. And I was like, I'm so tired. So I saw on their shelf that they had Narnia, and The Horse and His Boy is one of my favorites. So I picked it up and I started reading it, and I read and read, and I looked up, and they did not speak. All they did is like whenever there was a picture, I would open it and they would look at it, and then they would go back to be silent. And I was like, oh, this is so glorious. And the next time I babysat them, like a few months later, I was like, oh, I can read it. And they were like, no, you have to pick a different book. We read the entire series. And I was like, oh, I had influence on these literary children. Another one that also pops into my head is Tuck Everlasting. I don't know, something about reading that as an adult and finding it really just fun and enjoyable. I think aspects of Tuck can be misunderstood through different lenses, but I think that it's just a really cute and wonderful story that I think would relate to many children. Question number 13 is classics I would rename because I don't think that they have the best title. And this was really hard because I love titles, especially if you ask me to do this like YA books, I could do it all day. But I think that, you know, even if I don't think that it fits completely, like I can't imagine like Northanger Abbey, like yes, it works because it's kind of like her gothic and stuff like that, but there's also a lot more to that story. I don't think that it would work really with the and I don't think I would want to change her style to a totally different thing because she either has a place or she has two virtues / vices. So I don't know what I would do that for that. I did think of Daisy Miller because I think that The Turn of the Screw and other titles by Henry James have great titles, and this one has less of one, but I didn't really know how to do it. So the one that I thought of was The Perils of an American Lady in Europe, or like something around that, because it's really about this girl who is very misinterpreted because she's American and she's much more like outgoing and doesn't think about so much of like the fact that she can never be with a man, otherwise she will be, you know, said to be unpleasant words about women. It's a story about miscommunication and the collision of countries, and that's something that Henry James did a lot as an American who spent most of his life in Europe. And I think that would be an interesting way. Probably my title isn't the perfect one. And then I also had fun with some Anna Karenina because as much as Anna Karenina, like Anna Karenina is just such a powerful name and like I love it so much. Anna Karenina is not the only character in here, so like you could definitely change it a lot. One of the ones that I thought was funny was The Affairs of the Miserable Elite. Like it has that like oomph to it, but it's like also, yes, the miserable elite. Another one, if you want an and like War and Peace or Crime and Punishment, I thought of The Folly of Age and Youth, because you have these characters that are a little bit older that are falling in love with, like Anna Karenina is not old, but she's much older than the marriageable age and she's been married for like 10 years. And then we have Vronsky as well, who is an older man who has spent a lot of his time alone and quiet. And then we also have Karenin, who is this much older man who is kind of rediscovering himself and what his life looks like. And then we also have Stiva, who's just like full folly. But then we also have the younger people who are making decisions of like immaturity and youth and stuff like that. So we really have the folly of age and youth, because we have both the youth and the older people making mistakes of folly, and younger people trying to be too mature, but also, you know, being foolish sometimes and coming back. And some of them get a chance to change their circumstances and some of them don't. And Anna Karenina is just, I don't know, it makes me happy. I think that I didn't write one down because I felt overwhelmed at the possibility of this. But the last one is your favorite classic you'd like to recommend to everyone. How? Like, I have so many classic books, and also there's classic books that I'm like, I love this, I want everyone to read it, but not everyone would enjoy it. And like The Bell Jar, I think that that's a really important book about feminists and about mental health, but I also wouldn't necessarily recommend it to someone who's really struggling with those things. I have Anne of Gables, which, you know, selfishly I want everyone to read because it's wonderful and it's just gorgeous. Then we have books like The Letter of Birmingham Jail, where it's like, I think this is a really important civil rights thing. And why am I just mentioning the same books? I have such a hard time comparing classics because they're so diverse and I love them for such different reasons that like I feel overwhelmed to even recommend like one or even five.